Hello and welcome to this training being provided to you by the state of Washington's EMS division. My name is Stephen Murray. I'm going to be your trainer today. This training is called Caring for People Who Use Drugs. I am a retired paramedic and lieutenant from rural Western Massachusetts, which I'll talk about in a second. And I also have a couple of other roles, including I am the director of the SafeSpot Overdose Hotline, which we'll also get into later, and I also have an appointment as an adjunct clinical assistant professor at Boston University School of Public Health. Before we get started, just a quick disclaimer. I'm going to express a lot of views that are my own. They're not reflective of any of the organizations that I'm affiliated with, including Boston Medical Center, Boston University School of Public Health, and really this is my take on the current crisis, and so you can take it or leave it. I won't be offended, but I definitely want you to be aware that this is my take and my take only. And a further reminder, this project was funded by the Overdose Data to Action for States grant from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It was created in collaboration with the Washington State Department of Health. The information or content and conclusions are those of me, the author, and not any of those programs. I don't have any financial disclosures with any ineligible companies, but I do have this really cool Narcan license plate. If you want to read the story about why there's this picture of me holding it, just Google Narcan license plate and you'll be able to read up on it. So a little bit about my background and how I came to this work. I worked as a first responder from 2013 until the very end of 2021, so through the 2 main years of COVID. I started off as a volunteer firefighter, actually, and thought it was really cool and was looking for something fun to do, so I became a EMT and started working on an ambulance in the city of Pittsfield, which is a small city in rural Western Massachusetts. When I went and got my paramedic, I was working in northern Berkshire County. We were covering an area of about 265 square miles across both northwestern Massachusetts and southern Vermont, and also did a lot of interfacility work between some of our smaller rural hospitals and our major trauma and medical centers. I have taught CPR. I have been an naloxone instructor for many years. I have a long history of responding to overdose, a lot of fatal overdose. I became an EMT sort of at the beginning of the fentanyl era, when we first started to see it in the drug supply in 2014 here in Massachusetts, and had a doubling of deaths every year after that for several years. And as I was sort of finishing up my time in EMS, I was working on my master's degree, and one of the projects that I had to do was to make a practicum project. And so I decided to make this training, and this is actually an evolution from that original training from 2022, where I was trying to find a way to blend all of my lived and professional experience into something that would be useful for people to utilize. And so this is the sort of product of that, and I hope you enjoy it. On top of that, I'm also a person who uses drugs, and I'm a multiple overdose survivor from both opioids and stimulants. So the majority of my chaotic use happened between 2007 and 2011. I was a student at the University of Miami. I was studying political science. I'd been elected to the local village council. Here's me using drugs on all 3 of these pictures. So maybe not what you're used to seeing when you conjure up the idea of a drug user, and that's sort of the idea. The pictures on the top left is me pretending to graduate from college. I was 18 credits short when that picture was taken, but my whole family came out to see me pretend to graduate. I ended up finishing about 4 years later, but what happened much sooner after this picture was taken was that I went to rehab, and a big part of that was that my sister had come to stay with me during that graduation, and she was concerned about me and my safety, and had seen me nod out pretty heavily a few times while she was there. She also saw that I was nodding out with cigarettes in my mouth, and I kept had burn holes in my shirts and sweatshirts and on my couch, and she was worried I was going to burn my apartment building down. So she actually ended up outing me to my family, which is what started the whole process for me to go into recovery. I think it's important that we see that drug use does exist upon this like wide spectrum, and we often associate drug use with some of the more like traditional stereotypes of what drug users look like. And I just ask people to keep an open mind and think about the fact that drug use is something that a lot of people do, and you probably wouldn't know it unless you were privy to that information. So this is just a little bit about me. Since then, I have left EMS as of 2021. I took a job at Boston Medical Center. I'm now the Associate Director of Overdose Prevention and oversee SafeSpot Overdose Hotline. And a bunch of cool stuff has happened. I was able to go to the White House for Overdose Awareness Day and give my opinion there last year in August of 2024. I've written several papers that have been published. I trained the Massachusetts legislature on how to use naloxone. We became the first overdose detection hotline in the country to receive government funding back in 2023. And I was also featured on this episode of This American Life that's titled The Call. And so I encourage you to check that out if you're curious. I also was one of the experts that was chosen to give guidance to the federal SAMHSA administration on this document about caring for people who use drugs for first responders. So if you've ever seen that, I was one of the people behind that. All right, so our plan today, we have a couple of learning objectives. So we're going to talk about the drug supply, how harm reduction sort of plays into the health of folks that use drugs. We're going to look at ways in which EMS providers can improve treatment outcomes, talk about a little bit about language, handoff reports, and documentation, and then think about the role that EMS can play in community programs, public health, and combating fentanyl myths. I like to start off any presentation with a story, and this one in particular stuck with me since it happened. One of the first, maybe the first fatal overdose I ever went to was a young guy. He was in his 30s, and we got called out for a overdose. It was called in as a DOA, and we arrived on scene, and the cops were standing in the front door, and they were not going into the house. They were just standing in the open front door, and so I was wondering what was going on. And it turned out that the guy who had died was right there through the door in his mudroom. And what really struck me, this was in the middle of the night. It was like 2 or 3 in the morning, and what really struck me was that he was laying in a bed of his children's shoes, and just the image of this guy, young guy, he looked like he had come downstairs from bed, and knowing that with the amount of shoes that were on the floor, that it wasn't just one kid, it was a bunch of kids upstairs that would be waking up the next day without a dad, really stuck with me as being just a real insight into like what the overdose crisis looked like for people, and the collateral damage that overdose can cause in communities and in families. So this has always stuck with me. I always keep him in mind when I talk about overdose. As a father now, the thought of my kids waking up to me being dead is really just a horrific thing. And so I use this as a guidepost for my own work. One of the grounding myths I like to start with when talking about overdose is to address this idea that we're in an addiction crisis. And one of the things that's so important about the difference between an addiction crisis and overdose crisis is that not all drug use is addiction. And the challenge is that if all overdose is a result of addiction, then the solution is going to be more treatment. And that would make sense if everybody who was dying from overdose had a substance use disorder. But the reality is that right now, the overdose risk pool is everyone who uses drugs across the entire spectrum. And so overdose doesn't actually only happen to people with addiction. In fact, it may be protective for people who have active substance use disorder. This is just a couple of graphs to illustrate sort of this idea. So what we see on the right here is that looking at this age group of like teenagers, teen drug use has been actually relatively flat across the last decade. And actually, after COVID, we saw a decrease in students trying illicit drugs for the first time. But we end up seeing in a similar time period is a skyrocketing of overdose. And so what we're seeing here is less young people trying drugs for the first time, but more of them dying from overdose. And so what we can sort of glean from this is that the drug supply is really unstable and really unsafe. But prevention is working in terms of less people trying for the first time. It's just a higher percentage of them are actually dying from overdose. And so when we think about substance use disorders, what are some reasons why they might be protective from overdose? So here's my list. So the first thing is that tolerance to opioids is really important to being able to deal with the fluctuations in the potency of the drug supply. So my example, so if you take, if you use 10 bags of dope a day, and the 11th bag you take is more potent than maybe the last ones you took, you're going to have a certain level of opioid tolerance that's going to protect you from overdose in that state. Whereas if you never use and you buy that 11th bag as your first bag, now you're not going to have the tolerance to protect yourself from that. The next thing is that medications for opioid use disorder, so we're talking about Suboxone and methadone in particular, are either partial or full opioid agonists, and so they actually function very similarly to having opioid tolerance because they are opioids and therefore give you some floor. And we know that these medications reduce risk of fatal overdose significantly. The next thing about from a safety standpoint is that people who regularly use have a lot more knowledge generally about drugs. They have established routines and safety techniques that they use that they've developed over time and learned from other people. They may have had access to a harm reduction program, which could have given them better use, safer use practices. They're much more likely to use with experienced friends as well, which is called spotting. And so they may take turns or alternate. In the story I give, you have two inexperienced guys that died locally here earlier this year, and they both used at the exact same time and died from an overdose together in their car on the beach. And that is an example of inexperienced use, folks using together at the same time. Whereas we have a lot of people who use on the hotline who actually will use timers to check each other and make sure that they're ready to respond to their friend's overdose before they use themselves. The other major thing is that the more you use, the more likely you are to have an established relationship with your drug dealer, with your supplier. And that's important because it opens up a line of communication. So if I've never met my dealer before, they're going to be worried that I'm a cop, or I'm, about to get them in trouble, or they don't trust me, or they can tell that I'm nervous. And so they're just going to kind of give me the drugs, take the money, and go. Whereas when we think about people who use regularly and have the same dealer over time, their dealer might say to them, hey man, by the way, this stuff really sucks. Sorry, it's what I got right now. It's not very good. You're going to have to use more of it. Or he may say, hey, be careful. This stuff's really strong. I already had a couple of my people fall out from it. So just being aware that, that is some important communication. And when people are arrested, when dealers are arrested and you have that breakdown and people are going to new people, some of that benefit gets taken away. The other grounding concept that I like to start with is to think about drug use a little bit differently. So we often hear that drug use is put through this idea of a moral failure. And I think a lot of that comes from this idea that because drugs are illegal, people who do things that are illegal are criminals, and criminals are bad. And so drug use means you're a bad person. And I like to think of it a little bit differently, which is that drugs are pretty normal, and a lot of people use drugs for a lot of different reasons. And here's some of the reasons that I've come up with that I think people tend to use. A lot of these are the reasons why I used. One of the most common, of course, being that people are using drugs to cope with emotional and physical trauma. Trauma is a major sort of factor that most people who have a substance use disorder, at least, will say is one of the reasons why they use. But I think that that's the one that's sort of the go-to. There's also a lot of other reasons. Drugs are fun. People use them for pleasure and for rest. People enjoy them. If they weren't fun, people wouldn't do them. We know, by going to any college campus in America and going into the library, you can probably find people who are using Adderall to study who aren't prescribed it. That's where we used to buy it a lot of the time. We go around the library and find people who were, who had Adderall that wanted to sell, and it would help you study. So it would be used for productivity. We also have this ongoing chronic pain crisis in the United States. So one of the major backlashes to the sort of first wave of the opioid crisis was this cutback in prescribing of opioids. And this actually has impacted chronic pain patients significantly because they're not able to access adequate amounts of pain relief for chronic conditions, which they may have been on pain medication for 20 or 30 years. And actually, one of the final overdoses that I responded to before I retired was a woman who was in her 80s, and she had been on a stable dose of oxycodone for like 30 years, and her doctor got arrested. And when he got arrested, there was nobody else in the area who was able to prescribe for her, and so she was in this horrible pain. She had a terrible car accident. Her back was like broken in multiple places where it couldn't be fixed by surgery. Opioids were working for her to keep her pain managed. And so, what did her grandson do? Well, he went out and bought her fentanyl from the street, and so she was using that to stay out of pain. And like most people who use from the illicit supply, unfortunately, she eventually had an overdose. And I got the chance to talk to her after we, woke her up and we're chatting with her, and she said, "Well, what else am I supposed to do? Nobody will prescribe me anything for pain." And so this is one of the major consequences that we're seeing now. Now, if we were in a live audience, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you've had a caffeinated beverage or a coffee. And I know, like as an EMS person, there's a really good chance that you who are watching this video have had caffeine today. I am very guilty. I drink energy drinks. This is my Clean Cause energy drink. I had a large iced coffee with an extra shot of espresso. I love caffeine. But what's interesting is that caffeine is a drug. It's a psychoactive drug. And actually, the way we talk about it, we often romanticize our relationship with coffee to the point where people, like to talk about it similarly to how they might talk about alcohol or their drug use. And I like to point out, like, this is some pretty stereotypical drug user behavior here. This is at an airport. You can go to any airport in America and watch people standing in line to get their fix right before they get on their plane. They may even be like risking missing their flight because they need it so badly. I guarantee that many of the people watching this video have been late for work because they stopped to get Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks. You're in Washington, so I think you guys are pretty Starbucks loyal. But my wife gave the example. She's back in school right now. She's in nursing school, and she said that there's this woman that's late for class every single day and comes in with her Dunkin' in her hand. And so that's like an example of like, oh, well, there are sometimes consequences to this substance use. And what's really interesting about caffeine is that it can actually be fatal or lethal if it's not safely sourced. Caffeine is a drug. It's a psychoactive drug. We get it from a measured dose when we drink it in coffee or energy drinks, etc. And the idea behind that is that it should be relatively safe for you to drink if you're getting it from that sort of source. And so here's an example of this guy. He was in the United Kingdom. He lives in Wales. He was a personal trainer and an athlete. And he was drinking a mix of like having a protein shake after he exercised and then having his coffee. And he decided like, oh, I should just buy caffeine powder online and then mix it in with my protein shake. And so that's what he did. But he didn't buy a scale or a scoop that was sensitive enough to measure out what he needed to measure. And so he actually ended up putting the equivalent of 200 cups of coffee into his one drink, which he then chugged down. According to his wife, after chugging this down, he got very sweaty. He started to complain of chest pain. He started to seize, went into cardiac arrest, and was unable to be revived. And so what they found when they did the coroner's report was that he had roughly 392 milligrams per liter of caffeine in his blood system, where 1 cup of coffee would actually usually only generate 2 to 4 liters of caffeine per liter of blood. So pretty significant. So we often take for granted that we're getting it from this measured dose, but caffeine actually has the potential to be lethal. And to take it one step further, Panera had this incident with their charged lemonade. If you look up on the top right, you can see what the sort of dosage was. So 1 30-ounce drink of this charged lemonade was 389 milligrams of caffeine, which is pretty significant. That's like 5 cups of coffee. And so what happened here was that a couple of people ended up dying from caffeine overdose. They both had sort of pre-existing heart conditions that they may or may not have known about. But if you could just imagine, like you were going to Panera, you were studying and you were going to sit there for a couple hours and do work, like I can chug down a lemonade in like 30 seconds and be like, oh, I got free refills and go back. And then all of a sudden now I've had 800 milligrams of caffeine, which is like pretty significant, especially if you don't have a history or a tolerance to that supply. That could be really substantial. I consume somewhere around 600 to 800 milligrams of caffeine a day, but I also am like a tank on it, and so I have a really high tolerance. Whereas, someone who doesn't do that every day, that could be enough to be life-threatening. And so What ended up happening was Panera pulled their Charged Lemonade off the shelves because it was too dangerous for them. And so I like to get back to this and think about, we're all drug users in some way. Some of us just have a lot of privilege and safety with the drugs that we're using. And so next time you look at that cup of coffee, I want you to think to yourself, this could be decaf, which would be terrible, of course. Or this could have the equivalent of 200 cups of coffee in it. And what would that look like for you? Like if that was the choice that you were making every day, would you stop drinking coffee? Would you, change how you used your daily dose? Would you find another supply? Would you try to test it? Would you try to use it with a friend? We don't think about this stuff because we actually have the privilege of using from a safe and source supply. So just think about that every time you pick up a cup of coffee. And so this brings me to this idea of consumer protection. And when we look at products like this, often I think we conflate the ideas of health and safety. So I like to look at them as very different things. So most of the stuff on here, if you think about like using one dose or one cigarette or having one sip of, a beer or drinking a Coke, we're not assuming that it's going to be unsafe for us to consume that. Now, it is unhealthy for us to consume these things. And that is what brings us down in public health to thinking about like what are the things that we can do in public health to, either encourage people not to use as much of it or to change how they use it. So with cigarettes, of course, we see really high taxes, restrictions on advertising, etc. In alcohol, you're not allowed to actually drink the alcoholic beverage in a commercial. So you'll always see them like holding it or about to drink. There's all these ways that we think about. An example with soda in New York City, they had a soda tax for a while where they were taxing soda to try to decrease how much people were consuming it. So we have all these different ways that we try to reduce use while not actually compromising the safety of it by banning it or not allowing it to be around. Now, what's interesting about health and safety is that when you look at this group of things, you might not realize what the least safe thing is on here. No, so it turns out that the lettuce on the Big Mac is the least safe thing on this slide. It's the one that's most likely to cause sickness, illness, death, and need to be recalled. And the second most unsafe thing is the meat on the burger. So the things that we think of as being the most healthy actually are the most unsafe. And so that to me is an interesting concept because it really underscores this idea that we conflate these ideas of health and safety, and it actually makes people less safe when we ban substances or we ban things that they're going to use anyway and force them to the illicit market. And so in this example, imagine you had a friend who was anaphylactically allergic to peanuts, and he liked to do Coke once a year on his birthday. So he doesn't, normally he's just like this normal dude. Maybe he works with you on the ambulance. Maybe he, is someone that you went to high school with, and he's got a sort of normal life. But he did Coke when he was in college, and he misses it, and so he does it once a year on his birthday. Now imagine his dealer was someone who loved peanuts, and if you're allergic to peanuts, you read the label on everything. So you would pick up the label of your energy drink and you'd look at it and be like, okay, this is not made in a place that like deals with peanuts. Now, this one time of the year, he would be consuming a product where he wasn't able to verify before putting it in his body whether or not it was a safe or unsafe product for him. And so what's interesting is that he could have this anaphylactic reaction because his dealer had peanut dust on his hands that then got onto the equipment, or he put peanuts on the table that he used to cut the different Coke into bags. And so what ends up happening is he dies from a peanut anaphylaxis exposure rather than from something related to the substance itself. And so using Coke once a year, while probably not advised for someone who is like older or has like a heart condition or whatever, is not necessarily the most like healthy thing, but it actually is not that unsafe generally to use once a year if you were to use from a pure source. And so we've sort of like surrendered here to allow the illicit market to take over and then have absolutely no regulation over those products and be able to keep them safer. And so we all often fall into this dichotomy of good drugs and bad drugs. So we think about like caffeine and alcohol and weed even as being like good drugs. And then we talk about cocaine or heroin or meth as being bad drugs. but really it's not that effective from a health or safety standpoint because it really is not accurate. So much of what we consider to be risks of these drugs are actually worsened by the fact that they're illegal and wouldn't exist in a legal regulated supply. And so, one of the examples I like to give is that when we sort of pulled all of the prescribed opioids away from people and said, like, okay, opioids are dangerous because they cause addiction and dependence, and now we want everybody to use NSAIDs immediately post surgery for 2 weeks, or if you have chronic pain to take them every day. When we think about the actual long-term health impacts of something like Tylenol, for example, like we know that Tylenol is incredibly liver toxic over time, especially if someone drinks. And so, what are the long-term health risks of someone taking Tylenol every day for the rest of their life compared to taking an opioid every day for the rest of their life? These things have risks and benefits, and all drugs have risks and benefits. I take several medications. One of the ones that I take, which is Wegovy, has the potential to paralyze my stomach permanently and could increase my risk of developing thyroid cancer. But the benefit for me of losing weight, and I've lost 60 pounds from taking it, is that I have lowered my risk for cardiovascular disease. I've reversed my prediabetes. I've fixed my cholesterol. So I'm having all these benefits from it, but that doesn't actually take away from the fact that there are still risks to me using this medication. And so we're really accustomed to this idea of thinking about medication risks and benefits. And so I always question, like, why do we have this disconnect when it comes to drugs like heroin or cocaine or meth? And I use this example from the ambulance. This is a AI recreation with a much better looking, very Euro paramedic talking to a guy. And in this example, I picked up this guy at his house. He was like in his 70s. And his family had called us because he was intoxicated from alcohol, and he was being inappropriate and a bit combative, and they wanted him to go sober up in the hospital. And so we got him in the ambulance. He was fine. He was friendly enough with me. He understood, like, that he had screwed up because his family was calling. But on the way up to the hospital, he said to me, how do you do this job? And I thought he was like, oh, he was going to talk to me about my terrible pay. But no, he said, how do you do this job? I said, well, what do you mean? And he's like, well, you're just picking up the same junkies every day, having overdoses every day. And I don't know how you do it. And I was like thinking to myself, like, dude, like, you're in the back of the ambulance because you are technically overdosing on alcohol. And like, that is not that different than someone who's overdosing on heroin. And so I actually don't see them as being different. I didn't have that discussion with him because he was intoxicated. But it has stuck with me as one of those things where it's like, oh, there is a major disconnect here. So the first drug I want to talk about is fentanyl. We hear about it all the time. It's in the news a lot. It's often cited by law enforcement and politicians, and it's in popular media a lot. But we all often think about fentanyl from the medical aspect of it, which is that we give it as a frontline pain medication. But when we think about it within the illicit supply, there's a pretty long history of it being around. It actually appeared as an adulterant, decades ago in New York City, and has been sort of in and out of the supply. But we really started to notice it, especially here in the Northeast. It became a sort of frequent adulterant in 2014-ish. And we started to see the overdose deaths double year after year as a result of fentanyl being in the drug supply. And so the way that it started was an adulterant. It would come in, it'd be added into, say, heroin to make it stronger, or to stretch product, or to be able to deliver it as a cheaper product. And we would see a huge rise in overdose over a couple of days when it was added in, and then it would disappear again. We'd go back to having heroin primarily as the drug. And then it would come back, and we'd get another big thing of overdoses. And there's some major primary differences between how heroin interacts in the drug supply versus fentanyl. So heroin is a long-acting opioid. It's very similar to morphine. It lasts 3 to 4 hours. So we think about its duration of action, so how long people will stay on withdrawal or feel that it's working. That would really only make them have to inject somewhere between 4 and 8 times a day, depending on their metabolism and sort of what their needs are. Fentanyl, as we know from using it in the ambulance, is a very short duration of action. And so It needs to be dosed roughly every 30 to 60 minutes in order to feel it and to keep out of withdrawal. What does that mean? Well, if someone's using it chronically, which is not how it was designed to be used, they're going to have to inject somewhere between 10 and 18 times a day to stay out of withdrawal. So that changes a lot. That means that they're going to have to use more syringes and that they have more chances of overdosing and that they have sort of like this higher financial demand. It also makes it really difficult to function. So when I was using, I had Oxy, which is much more similar to heroin. And I was able to hold down a job and school quite easily. I would, wake up and use. I'd go to my car during my break or to the bathroom, and I'd use. I'd come home and use a few times a night and then go to bed. If I had to break away every 30 or 60 minutes, it'd be really difficult to work. It makes it really difficult to sleep, and so it becomes a much more challenging environment to be a drug user in when you have only fentanyl in the supply. And the other major issue with it is that because it is so much more potent, it makes it really difficult to accurately measure it. And so this causes a lot of challenges around accurate dosing and then this potency issue around cross-contamination, which we're going to talk about here in the next slide. So the primary challenge here is that fentanyl is being found in other drugs, non-opioid drugs as well. So like cocaine, crack, meth, counterfeit pills, etc. And what ends up happening is that we see these rise in what I call a hyperlocal overdose. So we see this big increase in fatal overdose and non-fatal overdose in a small geographic area over a short time. So we had this happen here in Boston a couple of years ago, where a bunch of people overdosed all in the same area over the course of the day. Word got out, it was in cocaine. And then it stopped. One of the more famous cases is the one down here on the bottom left-hand corner, which was at a delivery service in New York City that was delivering cocaine to people's doors, had some cross-contamination, and fentanyl made it into several of the cocaine doses that were sold by that service, and multiple people died as a result of that service. And when we look at what our drug checking stuff looks like, so this is an example of a sample from Lynn, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston here. And this is from November of 2022. This was associated with an adverse event, which usually means that somebody died from this sample. And if you look, you'll see here that cocaine, it was sold as Coke. So the person who bought it is expecting it to be cocaine. And it was mostly cocaine. So 1900, so these are all ratios. So 1900 parts were cocaine. And fentanyl only made up a very small percentage of this sample. Now, what is incredibly challenging is that this person, if they had an opioid tolerance or they were on, Suboxone or methadone, they probably wouldn't have even noticed that there was fentanyl in their cocaine. But for someone who's fentanyl naive, this could be enough to cause an overdose. And if they're alone, it can cause a fatal overdose. And so this is one of the challenges. So how does this happen? Well, I made this video to try to explain it. So I sort of chalked this up to cross-contamination at the local dealer level, so the most local dealer. And so let's imagine that in your small town, you have one dealer in this area who sells both Coke and fentanyl.
When you get down to
he sells both drugs. So he often gets them at the same time from the same dealer, and so he'll cut them on the same table. So here he is in this example, the brown powder, which is actually turmeric, is going to be our fentanyl. And so he takes his big thing of powder, puts it on the table, cuts it into 5 different bags, and then he's going to bag it up.
Job of sanitizing the table in between each cut.
So he does that. It all goes into separate bags. Now, this guy is not a genius. He's also not a quality control expert. And so, that table looks good enough. Looks clean enough for me. I would eat off that table. And so now it's time for him to cut his Coke. And so he puts the Coke on the table. This is salt in this example. And he's going to cut that down into 3 separate lines and put it into 3 separate bags. And little does he know, you can see here, the brown powder that is inside has now gotten into all 3 samples. And so he's got 3 separate samples that all have little specks of
and if these are both the same color,
now, keep in mind that both cocaine and fentanyl are white powder, so you would be able to see this. And so now 3 people who are buying these 3 separate bags may end up having a non-fatal or fatal overdose as a result of this. So this is how I think this is happening with the supply. Now, another adulterant that we're seeing a lot of, and actually in some markets it became a dominant part of the supply, is xylazine. And xylazine is a mostly non-opioid tranquilizer that we see used in veterinary medicine. It was never approved for use in humans. It's actually an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist, so it's similar in its structure to clonidine, except it's very sedating. It's a tranquilizer. It is not new. We have seen this used since the early 2000s, in particular in Puerto Rico. A lot of what we know about xylazine comes from studies that were done by researchers in Puerto Rico, which if we had not had that early on, we wouldn't really know what we were dealing with. And so there's a lot of reasons that we see it. The main one is that it is cheap and easy to get. It's a white powder. When it's dried out from this liquid form, it can be dried to a white powder. It's then cut into fentanyl, and it prolongs the duration of the high. So we were just talking about fentanyl is very short-acting opioid. So adding in xylazine could give it some duration, and it lasts for like 3 to 4 hours, and it causes extreme sedation. On the street, it's called tranq. In Hispanic communities, you may hear it referred to as sueño, which means dream, but it's something that we're seeing quite a bit of in the Northeast in particular. So what are the sort of primary effects? So when we think about its acute effects, of course, sedation is the main one. These are some of the other things that we see: some bradycardia, hypotension, respiratory depression, disorientation, drowsiness, etc. Some of the chronic effects, which we'll talk about in a second more in depth, are skin wounds. But we also were seeing incontinence, and I think that's probably from being like tranquilized for several hours without knowing that you were unresponsive. And then also we see a lot of dysglycemia, so both high and low blood sugar. So if you have someone who overdoses and you think that xylazine's involved, remember too that when someone is altered, you should check a blood sugar. You don't want to be that paramedic that walks in with someone who's altered still and has a blood sugar of 14. And then the other thing that we're seeing is some profound anemia. So let's talk about sedation real quick. So there's a lot that can happen with sedation. So people who are being tranquilized for long periods of time have other risks that come into play. Of course, we think about overdose a lot in this, but I actually like to focus here on the environmental risk. So one of the major things that we saw is that people who were unresponsive for 3 or 4 hours were becoming victims of theft, assault, sexual assault, etc. So this ends up changing the equation of like when you can use, who you can use with, like when is it safe to use, like is this person that I'm with a safe person, like safe enough for me to be unresponsive for 3 hours around. And then when we start to think, right now when I'm recording it, it's August here in New England, it's hot. If you're sitting out in the sun for hours after you've used, like you're going to be dehydrated, have horrible sunburns, have had heat, potentially be, in the middle of heat stroke. And then as we shift into the winter, seeing the opposite, which is like hypothermia and frostbite. So being aware that like this like elemental aspect is really significant for people who are using xylazine. And then I'd like to also point out too that like someone who's been immobile for a prolonged amount of time has increased risk for blood clots and rhabdo. And so you may see like compartment syndrome type injury where you have someone who's like knotted out and they're laying on their arm, and then when you like revive them and flip them over, you notice that their arm is like bright red. You need to be cautious that person could have rhabdo. It's very significant, and so just like making sure you know people's positioning on your arrival is also super important. Now, when it comes to skin wounds, xylazine wounds are really severe. If we back up to like where the history of injection wounds is that they're usually caused by bacteria. So there's either like bacteria on the needle or on the person's arm that didn't get wiped off or in the drugs that they're injecting. And that bacteria gets injected into the skin. It starts off as a local infection, which then spreads and becomes systemic if it's unchecked. And the treatment for that would be IV antibiotics. And that's the traditional history of an injection wound. Xylazine's a little bit different. Xylazine actually causes the wounds. The drug itself causes the wounds. And so being aware that like this is something where people's injection habits are not as significant, and we actually see xylazine cause wounds even when people are not injecting. So even smoking, booty bumping, and sniffing can cause wounds. And they actually start as more of like an ulcer. and they can coalesce. These little ulcers can coalesce. We've seen wounds form in acne sites even, and the interesting thing is that they're actually not infectious at baseline, and most of them don't need antibiotics. What they need is really good, proper vein wound care, which can be done in the outpatient setting. But helping people to feel comfortable showing these wounds to healthcare providers is a really important function of our jobs. And then, of course, it's important to look out for some of the red flag symptoms. These wounds can develop to be much more significant infections. And so, keeping in mind your sepsis symptoms, thinking about what happens if skin is to turn dark or black, or if they are complaining about pain near joints or in joints, also really, something to be aware of. And so looking for exposed bone or tendons, these are all things that you should be on the lookout for. Some of the other adulterants that are on my radar, at least, the top one right now that we're looking at here in Massachusetts is called Tenuvin, also known as BTMPS. It's a chemical additive that's used to protect plastics in medical and food industries. The interesting thing about it is it's a calcium channel blocker, and so it has cardio impact. And so being aware that this is one of the things that we should be looking for is low blood pressure or potential changes in someone's heart rate. Users usually report that it smells fishy or like a shrimp ramen, and it can burn while injecting because it does have this chemically type thing. They also report nausea and vomiting. There's no known antidote, of course, for this, and so just being aware that it's in the supply. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of we're starting to see some of are nitazines entering the drug supply. So nitazines are a family of synthetic opioids. There's no drug called nitazine, but they vary in their potency. Some are less strong than fentanyl, and some are significantly stronger than fentanyl, and so this varies a lot. One of the more potent ones is this one here on the right in the middle example, which is the N-pyroladino protonitazine. That's one of the most potent. And what we know is that naloxone does work on all of the nitazines, as far as we're aware. It doesn't necessarily call for higher dosing or anything like that, but just being aware that this is another synthetic opioid that's in the supply. Then we're seeing quite a bit of bromazepam. It's a benzo. They call it a designer benzo. It's not new. It's been around since the 70s, but it was not approved to be used in humans. And we see this a lot in fake Xanax pills or fake Klonopin pills, but it's also showing up in other pills. In this example, this M30 Percocet that was sold had bromazepam in it. And then finally, we're starting to see medetomidine a lot. It's another alpha-2 adrenergic agonist, sort of similar to xylazine. And it is something that's used mostly in dogs, actually. It's another tranquilizer. And one of the major differences, it seems, between medetomidine and xylazine is that it causes more profound bradycardia. So we're seeing very low heart rates, anecdotally, with people who are exposed to it. Starting to see that more. No approved human antidote for any of these. So just be aware of that. And so I direct you, though, back to the sample that's in the middle here where, it was sold as a pill. We know that people who use pills generally are less experienced users, so young people or people who are recreationally using. This sample has fentanyl, xylazine, bromazepam, and the most potent of the nitazines. And so this is the sort of risk environment I'm talking about when I say that not all people who are dying from overdose have addiction. This is something that some random kid could buy on the street thinking they're getting a Percocet, and what they've gotten is this really complex set of 4 potent drugs, including multiple families of drugs. You've got 2 opioids, an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist, there's a tranquilizer, and a benzo. That's an incredibly dangerous pill for people to be encountering. All right, so if we were doing this live, this is where I usually would shift to take a break. So if you are just getting through this, feel free to take a break. It's sort of a natural point to stop. But I'm going to shift now from talking about the drug supply to talking a little bit about what EMS can do and what's sort of available. So you'll hear a lot about harm reduction. Harm reduction is both a philosophy, but also this set of practical strategies. So what I talked about in the beginning around prohibition and the drug supply, a lot of that comes from the sort of philosophy or ideological side of harm reduction. And now we're going to talk about the more practical side. So we often think about harm reduction as risk reduction for dangerous behaviors. And we as humans love to do dangerous stuff. So an example, people love to jump out of airplanes. Very dangerous if you do that without a parachute. So we use parachutes, it makes it more safe. Humans love to engage in sex with people that they know or don't know. And this carries some risks, including the spread of HIV and other STIs. But we have condoms as an option to help keep that behavior safer. Cars, probably the most dangerous thing all of us do every day. We wear seatbelts and we have airbags, etc. So you kind of get the concept. The idea is that risky behavior is part of being a human, and these are things we do to make it safer. One of the things I like to point out about drug use harm reduction is that a lot of the things that we're doing to make things safer are actually harms and risks that are caused by prohibition and not by the drugs themselves, which is kind of one of the interesting things. So I sort of describe it as like, if you think about how cars were not as safe 20 years ago, and like you'd show up at what looked like to be like a minor car accident and the car looked fine, but everybody was dead inside. And now we have cars that are designed much better for crashes, and so you arrive on scene and it's like crumpled up and it looks horrible, but everybody's actually walking away from the accident. The drug supply is similar, right? We haven't made drugs safer, and so a lot of the things that we're doing to try to make drugs safer are really to make them safer because of the harms of prohibition. So I want you to keep that in mind. Now, if you were to walk into your local syringe program, these are some of the things that you might find. You may be familiar with some of them. Most people really only think about syringe programs as giving out syringes up here on the top left, but all of this stuff here is actually used, especially in the first 3 rows, is used within the injection process. And many of these things can be sources of infection between people. They can be sources of infection from bacterial involvement. So like we give out sterile water so that people don't use tap water, for example, to inject, because tap water is more likely to have bacteria in it that would be harmful if you injected it. If you are going to use a cooker, which is the second row, first box, those cookers are not to be shared between people because you can actually spread HIV and hepatitis C between them. And so when we think about people who smoke their drugs, hepatitis C can actually be transmitted between people from cracked lips. And so the bottom left-hand one, those are rubber mouthpieces that go on the ends of pipes. And the idea being that, like, one, you're less likely to crack your lips if you have something that is not going to get hot when you light the pipe. But also, like, if you have your own, you could share a pipe and not have to worry that you're like putting your lips on something that someone else had. So these are just some like basic ideas of things that we give out in harm reduction programs to make people safer. Why are pipes important? So one, we don't often find ways to engage drug users who smoke their drugs. And harm reduction programs, like, while they give out this whole group of like wonderful things that we saw in the previous slide, a lot of what they do is additional wraparound services. So they're testing and treating people for HIV and hepatitis C. They're helping with other STI testing or pregnancy prevention, or helping people navigate housing or other resources. And so a lot of people who are smoking their drugs are not likely to engage in one of these programs unless they hand out the supply to help get them in the door. So that's like the one piece, is that we want people to engage in these programs so that they have access to the other services that can make them healthier. The other piece of it is that pipes are generally safer than injection, so they carry less risk for spreading infection. They have a lower overdose risk generally, and so we actually want to encourage people who are injecting their drugs to try alternatives like smoking, because it can make their use safer. And so we're kind of getting a lot of benefit out of that. So when you hear politicians and people, right-wing media in particular, or even like the more liberal media talking about, oh, we're giving out crack pipes, there is a real legitimate public health reason to do this. It's not because we're just trying to hand out crack pipes to everybody. It's that we want people to have access to things that make them safer. And so the other piece of this is that we know, like, we work in emergency health. Emergency health care is very, very expensive, and treating chronic conditions is very, very expensive. Preventative health care, so healthcare that is done in order to sort of prevent the spread of illness or to prevent chronic illness, is much, much cheaper. And just to give you an example, and this is now probably an out-of-date number, the cost to treat someone for their lifetime with HIV is around $380,000, which is the equivalent of 5.4 million syringes, which would be enough for like 1,500 people to use unlimited amounts each per year. So we really want to try to reduce the spread of HIV for both the human cost, of course, but also there's a huge financial saving to people. So if that's what's important to you, this is a good reason to support it. Now, when I shift into thinking about overdose, one of the major things that's changed over time is the overdose timeline. If you've been doing this long enough, so you've been around for like 10 or more years, you may remember we used to show up on overdoses and people would actually still be breathing, kind of. They'd be breathing agonally, like they would be taking these horrible sounding, agonal breaths, or they'd be breathing 4 or 5 times a minute. So often they were at this period between respiratory depression and respiratory arrest. And so we would get a lot of saves at that time. People who are not yet in respiratory arrest, who've been moving some oxygen, are going to be a lot more likely to have a positive outcome after their overdose. Now, the problem is that once somebody goes from respiratory arrest to cardiac arrest, their likelihood of having a positive neurological outcome from that overdose reversal is very, very low. And in fact, I never saw it in my career where somebody who was in a confirmed cardiac arrest, so not where like someone couldn't find a pulse, but like where I had a monitor on them, we were unable to get them to return. Now, if we look at the sort of overdose timeline now, when people inject fentanyl, they're much more likely to go into an immediate respiratory arrest. So we're not going to have this period of respiratory depression where they're sort of like going more deeply into an overdose. And the problem is that time between a respiratory arrest and a cardiac arrest is what I like to call the countdown timer, and it's highly variable, and it really depends on a lot of things. So how old somebody is, what their overall state of health is, if they've had any recent illnesses that could be impacting their oxygenation, do they have any chronic health conditions that impact their like daily oxygenation, do they have a recent infection which impacts the strength of their heart, have they had a past myocardial infarction that has made their heart weaken, do they have congestive heart failure? Like these are all factors that come into play and really can like impact that timeline between respiratory arrest and cardiac arrest. So why is this important? Well, one, the major reason actually is that we as first responders, so to speak, should not be the primary responders to overdose. So people who are closest to those who are overdosing, so other people that use drugs and the family and friends, are the ones that should be responding to overdose first. Because if we get there and someone's already in respiratory arrest, or they have been, the likelihood that they actually have now gone into cardiac arrest, given our response times, is much, much higher. And so this really, to me, is one of the reasons why naloxone distribution, so Narcan distribution, is so important, is that we really need people on scene to be the ones that are responding to overdose first. So a couple things I like to think about with overdose response, just sort of like improve your skills, is that a overdose is a respiratory emergency. It's a respiratory emergency because the person is not moving air. So really, it's actually a ventilatory emergency. So the thing is, like if someone is breathing when you arrive on scene and they're breathing adequately, but they're unresponsive, they probably don't need naloxone. I have used 0.5 milligram of IM naloxone as like my sort of go-to first dose. If you carry the ones where you have to draw up the 0.4, that could be a great first dose as well. I usually use 0.5 because we had the brown box naloxone. But if that person's actually already breathing spontaneously, just support their breathing with a bag valve mask. Make sure they're oxygenating well. But you really don't have to give naloxone to somebody who is breathing, especially if it's more than 8 times a minute. It's actually contraindicated. And when we're dealing with a ventilatory emergency, it's really important that we remember some of the basics. I often see people bagging overdose, people who are experiencing an overdose, and not using a basic airway adjunct. And so you're pushing a lot of air into that person's stomach. You're really increasing the likelihood that person is going to vomit and potentially aspirate. And so please consider using a airway adjunct if you are doing that. Because overdoses are a ventilatory emergency, it's really important to focus on fixing just the hypoxia portion of that overdose when we're thinking about how much naloxone to be given. And what often happens is people give that next dose without actually doing a full reassessment. And so if you're kind of going off the idea that like, oh, that person hasn't woken up yet, so they need more, that is going to end up, encouraging you to give more than you probably need to give in terms of like naloxone. So I encourage you, like before giving an additional dose, or if you show up on scene and a dose has already been given, bag somebody for a couple minutes before you give more. And then, stop, see how are they oxygenating? Are they breathing already like 8 times a minute? Are they breathing 6 times a minute? But is it improving? And see, because often what ends up happening is people stack doses, and then all of a sudden the person comes to, and they have now been given 16 milligrams when they only needed a half milligram to get better, and so that can really increase the likelihood that they're going to get sick. And then how we talk to people when they come back from an overdose is often something that is not discussed in school, and I think that it's so crucial. When you come to after an overdose, you're going to be a little bit confused, feeling sick, not knowing what's going on, and often what I experience, at least in my time working, is that there'd be somebody leaning over them, screaming at them like, "Oh, what did you use? Tell me what you used." And the person's going to be like confused, and you're increasing the chance that they're going to get agitated. And really, like, what I found to be the most useful thing was to clear the room and try to create a therapeutic environment. And I say clear the room because we all know that an overdose is like a circus. Everybody comes out. You've got 4 police cruisers, an engine company, 3 ambulances, and a supervisor all there, as well as the family and any bystanders or onlookers that are around. And that is a scene. And nobody wants to wake up to 16 people in uniform in their bedroom, for example. And so what I usually would do is I would say, like, "Hey, thanks everybody for being here. If you guys could just, like, go wait outside, or get back in service, like, my partner and I can handle this. The person's going to come to in a second, and we're looking to try to have this be as peaceful of a wake up as possible." And then I would be down in the airway seat bagging the person. My partner would be kneeled next to them. That way, when they wake up, I'd say something like, "Welcome back. You overdosed. I've been breathing for you for a little bit. I gave you some naloxone. You may feel sick. Are you nauseous? Can I do anything for that?" And then really figuring out, how can I help this person, to feel safe and to feel supported. And a lot of times that means helping them to, deal with some of the symptoms of withdrawal. And so, right after an overdose, someone's going to be in precipitated withdrawal. We're going to see vomiting and nausea as sort of like the primary symptom. And I spend a lot of my time in EMS doing quality improvement. And I noticed that we give Zofran to everybody. It's like the most commonly given medication, maybe besides saline, but with the shortages that have happened since I retired, maybe that's not the case anymore. But Zofran definitely is like one of the main given medications, except after an overdose. And so I used to pull in paramedics and say, like, "Hey, I noticed that you reported that this person was vomiting after their overdose. But what ended up happening, you didn't give them any Zofran." And so the thing is it got viewed as being a punitive thing to withhold the Zofran for them. Well, they overdosed, so they deserved the negative consequences of that action. But that's actually not our job. Our job is to treat symptoms. And so if someone's reporting to you that they're nauseous, or you see them vomiting, you shall give them something to treat that unless they actively refuse it. And so remember, you don't need an IV to give Zofran. Most places you can give it either sublingually or you can give it IM. So please don't use that as an excuse. It's a crappy excuse. And then, like, acknowledging that opioid withdrawal sucks. It is a terrible feeling. I've been sick many times in my life since stopping opioid use. I had appendicitis, and I had COVID a couple times, and I've had the flu, and nothing is like opioid withdrawal. It's absolutely terrible. And this quote from a study that a couple of my friends did, I'll just read it. "You know what hell is? I think dope sick is that. That's hell on earth. I would rather have somebody saw my leg off at the knee than go through that." And I think that's a really accurate representation of what withdrawal is like for people. So being kind and recognizing that is a terrible thing for people to go through is really important. And then we're starting to see a lot of departments around the country start to look into or start to administer buprenorphine or Suboxone after overdoses. And I think a lot of times departments are like taking this on and not really told why. So to give you a little bit of context, in the era of fentanyl, it's been very difficult to get people to get onto Suboxone. It's not an easy transition to make when someone is a daily user of fentanyl to getting them onto Suboxone, because it requires some time of initiations of abstinence or tapering. They're going to be in withdrawal for a lot of it. It can be very uncomfortable. The one thing we have learned is that immediately after somebody gets naloxone, it's the easiest and fastest time to get somebody on to Suboxone. So if you have someone who is immediately post-overdose and they want to get on, that's going to be a very quick and effective process. So much so that some of the providers that get people onto Suboxone are actually having them Narcan themselves and then start their Suboxone because it's so effective in getting people on. So it's really a unique time. It's a unique time where people could potentially get on it, as long as you're doing it in a way that's like not coercive or gross. I encourage you to like look into doing this as something you could do in your service. Now, just a quick note on patient agitation after overdose. This is something that we hear about all the time, is that, oh, so-and-so came back from an overdose and they were violent and whatever. I think that this is actually a pervasive myth because it puts the blame on the person that overdosed for that behavior. And I think that actually, my experience has led me to believe that a lot of that is actually our fault or the fault of others on scene, whether it's law enforcement or a bystander, like a family member that's like making that person agitated, etc. So I like to look at it as 3 pillars, and sometimes you can control all of these if you're the first person on scene. Sometimes you can only control 2 of the 3. Sometimes you can't really control any of them, and that's too bad that you got there kind of late. But really, if you kind of hold these 3 things as being like equally important to, making sure somebody has a okay overdose experience, I guess is how you would put it, is that the first thing you want to do is make sure that person does not wake up hypoxic. When you're hypoxic, you're going to be confused, disoriented, etc. And so people need to be bagged. You want to try to normalize their oxygen level and their CO2 level prior to them waking up. That's step 1. Step 2 is reducing the total amount of naloxone they're getting. And this is the one that often is the most difficult because so many people give Narcan or naloxone to people before we get on scene. And so I acknowledge that this is the hard one. But if you are the first person on scene, or even if you're not, you can stop additional doses from being given. So if someone's already been giving naloxone when you get on scene, I would say, let's focus on bagging for a few minutes and see where this goes. And then the final thing is what we just talked about, which is like this therapeutic environment. So controlling the environment that person wakes up to. I think this is where we have the most power to be the one that sets the scene here, which is that we don't need all these people in here. And so I guarantee that if you can try to bring some semblance of control to these 3 aspects of overdose response, you're going to have people wake up a lot more pleasant than you may have been accustomed to. Now, you may have noticed that I, mentioned that my go-to dose is the 0.4-0.5 milligrams. And so I just want to just label this for a second that I don't think that there's any need for high-dose naloxone. So there is a lot of misinformation out there about, the potency of the drug supply necessitating this higher dose naloxone, but that's just not how it works. Naloxone is an incredibly potent opioid antagonist, meaning that it is very, very good at its job, which is to go in and unseat opioids from the receptors and then to sit there and block them. And so you have a finite number of receptors, and sort of standard dose naloxone, so like 0.5 milligrams to 4 milligrams really is the sort of maximum that you need in order to sort of achieve that. Now, we're seeing all these other products. So you've got this top product here, which is 8 milligrams in one spray, comes in a 2-pack. When someone gives both of those before you show up, you've already given someone probably 16 or 32 times more naloxone than they needed. That's a significant overdose of naloxone. And then even worse, we see this additional product, which has a very, very long duration of action, like 12 hours. So naloxone works for 30 to 60 minutes. Whereas this other product, nalmefene, we see this working for 12 or more hours. And so that person is going to be in this protracted, uncomfortable withdrawal. And I find it to be very cruel. So just being aware that I'm not supportive of these sort of additional products that are coming out. There's no need for them. Standard old school naloxone that's been around since the 60s works great and still works to this day. It works on fentanyl, it works on carfentanil, and it works on nitazenes. And so, please keep that in mind when you're doing purchasing or encouraging, what people can carry in their local area. And then this gets us to this other idea of you're going to re-overdose on when the Narcan wears off, it's often our most used thing that we tell people to try to force them to go to the hospital. Can we please stop doing that? It's not true. People know it's not true, and it actually erodes trust. Now, we've talked about duration of action a few times. So we know that fentanyl has a very short duration of action, somewhere between 15 to 30 to 45 minutes, depending on that person. And naloxone has a duration anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes, right? So we know that the naloxone is going to stay on the receptors longer than the fentanyl is. So some of this goes back to the olden days when we had Dilaudid in the drug supply. So Dilaudid's a long-acting opioid. So theoretically, if somebody took multiple doses of Dilaudid, they would maybe need to go onto a naloxone drip to sort of keep out of going back into overdose. But generally, with what is on the market today, what is available in the drug supply, this is a really, really unlikely thing to do. I think what ends up happening when we hear stories about people re-overdosing after they've been given naloxone is that person was in withdrawal and they used again. And they used again and they had a subsequent overdose. And often it's hard for families in particular to wrap their heads around this idea that person just overdosed and now they used again and overdosed again. And so I think this is a way to sort of excuse in their mind what seems like some irrational thing to do. But the reality is that it's a very rational thing to do, because what you're going to want to do after you are in withdrawal is use. And so when we've given someone naloxone, we have put them into withdrawal and they're going to need to use to get out of it. And so what we know is that person's going to use again. The first thing you can do, this might be the most controversial part, is ask the cops not to take their stuff. We already know how potent it is. It was potent enough to cause an overdose. That person's going to be a lot more careful the next time because they know that it's strong stuff. You could, even more controversially, offer to stay with them through the next time they're using to help them get out of withdrawal. That way, if they overdose again, you're still there. People need to get out of withdrawal. It's one of the sort of major side effects of naloxone is that they're going to be in this very painful withdrawal. And so they're going to want to use again. If they don't want to go on bupe and they don't want to go to the hospital, they're going to use again. If you don't want to be the one that does that and they don't have a friend that's staying there, put them on the phone with us. We will stay with them through their next use event. Say that their friend was there and they're I gotta go. Don't leave that person alone. Get them on the phone with SafeSpot, call us, and we'll hang out with them. And just make sure that they know that the risk of overdose is high, because they've just overdosed. And if you have an naloxone leave behind program, please leave some Narcan behind for them. And then I really want us to push back hard on this myth that overdoses are the thing that's overwhelming our EMS systems. I hear about this a lot. I peer reviewed a paper where they were claiming that overdose was the number one thing they were responding to, and it turned out that it didn't even rise to the occasion of alcohol calls. And I like to push back by thinking in EMS we have high utilizers of our systems. We have the person who, you show up and they're smoking while on oxygen and complaining that they're having difficulty breathing, right? We go to that person all the time. We go to the person that's having trouble managing their diabetes, whether it's because, their insulin, is they're having trouble figuring out the dosing, or because they just chugged an entire 2-liter bottle of Coke. We have the person that falls every single day, but they want to stay in their home. And so we go and we help get them back into their chair. And so we're really used to this as a system. We respond to high utilizers a lot, and I think it's part of what we do, and it's what we do best, is that we get out there in the community, we help high need people. And so some folks that overdose fall into this category of being high need people, and there's a level of compassion that you should have in doing this job, and try not to put the blame on drug users when we know that a lot of the people that we respond to across the spectrum are high utilizers. Now, I don't have this data for Washington State, unfortunately, so here's just a couple other states that I do have the data for. We know that fatal overdose mostly happens in people's homes. So you see here ranging from 60 to 85%. Most fatal overdoses are unwitnessed drug use. So 90% of people who die from overdose, it was unwitnessed, according to the CDC. So what does that mean? Well, it means that people are not dying on the streets at the same rate that they're dying in their homes. And so we started SafeSpot as an alternative to start to think about how do we serve people in their homes who are at risk for overdose. So the way it works is that you call a 1-800 number, you're placed on a brief hold. This month, our average hold time is 10 seconds. So within 10 seconds, you've been connected with a trained operator. they work with the person to make a safety plan, which usually takes somewhere between 1 and 6 minutes to figure out. And then they will use. And in the unlikely event that they overdose, we are there to help get EMS for them. And if they don't overdose, they go about their day. In like most cases, people select 911 as the person that they're, or the people that they want to come help them. But if they live in a duplex and their mom lives in the other apartment, or their roommates around, like, we can try to activate them first instead of the EMS system. But this is sort of how the service works, and it's available in all 50 states. This slide actually is from last month, where our hold time was 13 seconds. That was in July. This month, in August so far, in the first 6 days, I'm recording this on the 6th of August, we're at 10 seconds. And so Washington callers call us a lot. 21% of our total call volume comes from the state of Washington. A lot of it's in Seattle, but there are some other more rural areas that are utilizing the service. So if you show up at an overdose and there's nobody there except the person who's overdosed and their phone, we're probably listening in. So please be nice to our folks, or your boss may hear from me. Now, sort of finally, as we sort of go into this next section, I like to think about how the way we do care pre-hospitally, how that impacts people's long-term outcomes. So I'm going to give you the same example, sort of handled in two ways. So in this first example, the paramedic says, oh, this is a 35-year-old female heroin addict who's here because of how she injects. Her arms are pretty beat up. I told her she should stop using so this doesn't happen. There wasn't anything for me to do, so I turfed it to my BLS partner. He's new. He didn't do anything. So what happened on the way? Absolutely nothing. What happened when they got to the hospital? Very little. They ended up in the waiting room. They left without being seen. They just didn't feel appreciated. Now, this is an actual example of someone who's now a very good friend of mine. Here's what my handoff report looked like. So the patient's a 35-year-old woman with a history of injection drug use. So now I've used person first language to describe her. Here's the story. She recently had her car stolen and has not been able to get to the syringe program. So she's been reusing the syringes she had left. This caused significant wounds to her forearms. I bandaged them up for the ride, but I noticed, because I put my hands on her, that she was hot to the touch. And so I checked and she had a fever. And so I did a sepsis workup, and it turned out she met sepsis criteria. Because she was in horrible pain, I gave her a little bit of ketamine IM. And then once she calmed down, I was actually able to start an IV, give her some fluids, and also hang some ketamine in a bag to get through the first little bit of time that we're here in the ED. So what happened on the way? Well, she got her wounds bandaged. She got pain management. I did a full set of vitals and was able to determine that she was septic. I called a sepsis alert, which means she got instant physician care when we got to the hospital. I got an IV, and I drew labs, and I started saline. So a lot got done, right? Because I looked at her as a patient, as a complex medical patient, and was able to get her help. Now, what ended up happening with her? She got IV antibiotics quite quickly because of the sepsis alert. She ended up admitted to the ICU, and then she was started on Suboxone, which she was on for a couple of years, then moved over to Sublocade, and now has been sober for more than 4 years. So this is an example of a person who was going through something. She got good care, and that good care was able to be built upon itself, and now she's doing a hell of a lot better. And so you may have noticed that until this last example, I hadn't used any stigmatizing language, and stigmatizing language is challenging. I know we don't want to be the language police here. It does get old. I get it. But we actually do know that using stigmatizing language towards people does impact how they're given care. And so in this one study, they were asked to look at patients' charts. These doctors were looking at patient charts, and the ones where there was stigmatizing language had worse care than the ones where they used person-first language. And so I ask you to try to think about how to fix or improve the language choices that you make. We use person-first, so it's a person who uses drugs, a person who has a substance use disorder, someone who's in recovery. These are just more, instead of saying addict, junkie, etc. Just a different way of thinking about it. And then, when we hand off our patients to the hospital, how we talk about them ends up having a impact on how they're then received by staff at the hospital. So they trust the hospital, and if you have a system where you work well together, they trust what you're saying. So if you are biasing them towards the patient as you walk through the door, they're going to trust what you're saying. They're like, that patient's going to get worse care. I try to keep things very patient-centered, objective, and I talk about what was done on the way, what I think is going on, and I keep it at that. That way I don't add any unnecessary stigma to that person. And then I wish someone had told me this when I was working in EMS, that like people beyond the insurance companies read your reports. This is just like one of those things where I feel like we just don't get it communicated that well to us, that our data actually matters. Like the stuff that we put in our reports helps to drive policy. And we look at EMS data all the time in public health to think about interventions and what we can do to improve people's health and wellness. This goes beyond overdose. So all different aspects of EMS documentation are helpful and are looked at. So please just rest assured that what you're doing matters, and we care about what you write. So just be aware of that. And then this is like the thing I like to end on, which is that there's this very pervasive myth around mostly law enforcement being exposed to fentanyl and having a fentanyl overdose because they were near it, or they touched it, or they breathed near it, or whatever. I can tell you categorically that this is not real. I have an entire other training that I give where we spend an hour going through body cam footage, and I ask paramedics in particular, like, okay, would you give naloxone to this person in this situation? And like, we hear people that are hyperventilating, feeling like they're choking, etc., which are not symptoms of an overdose. We see them giving themselves naloxone, which is not something that can be done. And so I just ask that you push back on these myths, because they do have consequences. And universal precautions are more than sufficient. You guys know this because we almost never see EMS experiencing these symptoms. So just being aware that this is something that is an ongoing challenge, and that it's partially our duty, especially as first responders, to push back on misinformation that comes from first responders. So please, make sure, if this is happening in your town, offer to educate the police in your town about this and make them feel secure, like dealing with people who use drugs. You're not going to overdose on fentanyl by just touching it or being around it. So I like to make sure that gets out there. And then finally, the why EMS thing is really important to me, which is that EMS has this really rare opportunity where they get to be inside of people's homes and see sort of the more broad health environment that person has, that nobody else really gets to see who works in healthcare. Like when we bring a patient to the hospital wrapped up in a blanket like a burrito, they're just a body in a burrito. Whereas we got to see the full person. We got to see how they lived and their family and their pets and sort of like more of their environment. And so the one thing that I ask of you is that, like, you could be the only touch point that person ever has with the healthcare system prior to a subsequent fatal overdose. And like, we have a really hard time reaching these people and finding them, and you are right there. So if you have someone who has had an overdose in their home, please tell them about SafeSpot. Please make sure they have naloxone. Please make sure they understand the danger of using alone, because that may be the only time anyone from the healthcare system ever gets to talk to them about their overdose risk. And so it is incredibly important what you do. And also, if you are transitioning out of working in EMS, please consider public health as a route. We need more people with EMS experience working in public health, because you have had this very unique view. I feel like my EMS experience has been so helpful in giving me a different perspective on health than so many of the other folks that I work with. It's a lot of doctors and nurses in particular who work in public health. Like, please come join the ranks of public health, not necessarily around drugs, but around whatever interests you. So that's my one plea to you. And as always, I am open to, your feedback, and I'd love to hear from you if you have questions, or you want to talk about public health jobs, or you want to ask questions. Because this is not a live segment, please reach out to me if you have thoughts or questions. That's my personal email address. My DMs are open on all of these platforms. LinkedIn's probably my preferred one now. So feel free to add me on there and DM me, or send me an email. But I would love to hear from you. And thanks so much for your attention. And I really appreciate it.